People think grief makes you weak, but in truth it makes you dangerous. It strips you down to your most honest self. No pretense, no patience, just raw clarity about who you are, what you've lost, and who around you is quietly circling, waiting for the moment you break. When my husband, Charles, passed away, I didn't fall apart. I became still. We had been married for 32 years, built everything together. A family, a legacy, two businesses, one in real estate, the other in private logistics. Charles was meticulous, ruthless in the boardroom, gentle at home. He kept our assets protected, diversified, and untouchable. So when the pancreatic cancer came, and came fast, he didn't waste his time fighting inevitability. He used every moment to plan. He left me everything. Not just our main properties, our private accounts, or our cabin in Big Sur. He left me $33.4 million in assets that only I knew existed. The inheritance wasn't public. Not even my daughter, Ava, knew the full extent. Charles and I had agreed, we don't raise heirs, we raise adults. And adults didn't need to know numbers to understand value. But after his funeral, once the condolences faded and the flowers browned in their vases, I saw something in Ava's eyes that I couldn't name yet, but it made me uneasy. At first, I thought it was grief. But grief doesn't smile like that. It doesn't shimmer in brand new diamond earrings purchased just days after burying your father, or in the way she laughed too loudly when I asked about her husband's new car. I mean, we've got connections now, she said, brushing it off. And you know how Marcus is. He always lands on his feet. Marcus, my son-in-law, he was charming in that polished, over-rehearsed kind of way. MBA, legacy prep school, tailored suits that screamed funded, not earned. He worked in venture capital, or something close enough to it to be vague. The kind of man who always looked just past your shoulder, like someone more valuable was standing behind you. They had been married 4 months, and something was already off. He started showing up at my house without Ava, asking casual questions about Charles's estate planning, making comments like we should make sure Ava has access to everything she's entitled to. God forbid something happens to you. Laughing too hard, watching me too closely. I gave him tea, smiled politely, let him talk, and said nothing. Because silence, as Charles taught me, is a woman's sharpest weapon. The truth was, I had power now. Real power. The kind that didn't come with noise, but with control. Liquid assets in multiple accounts across 4 countries. Property trusts. Offshore holdings designed not to hide, but to protect. And the key to every last dollar sat in a folder in my study drawer. With my name on every line. I could have told Ava. I could have sat her down and explained the full scope of the legacy her father left behind. Not just the money, but the strategy, the protection, the why. But something in her tone when she talked about reinvesting and leveraging family ties made me pause. So I waited. And while I waited, I watched Marcus. He was the kind of man who touched the small of his wife's back a little too often when others were watching, who brought her drinks without asking but never poured one for her mother, who called me Maureen like we were equals when we absolutely were not. And Ava? She started pulling away. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations declined. Holidays shortened. Then came the family dinner. When she showed up in a couture dress I knew she couldn't afford, glowing with some secret she hadn't quite decided to share. Marcus sat beside her like a king at court, smug and steady, hands folded, always watching. They thought I was soft. That widowhood had dulled me. That silence meant surrender. But I had spent decades learning how to hold my tongue until it cut deeper than any shout. And what they didn't know was this. Charles left me the fortune, but he also left me the map. And if they tried to steal my daughter away from me for their own gain, they'd be walking straight into the fire. The next signs came slowly, like cracks in polished marble. Ava stopped visiting altogether. At first it was the usual. Marcus has work, or we're renovating the guest bathroom, or we're just so busy these days. But then the tone of her voice shifted. It lost its warmth, replaced by a brittle tightness, like every word cost her something, like I was calling from the wrong side of a line someone else had drawn. Then came the invitations to events I was expected to attend, not welcome to. Ava and Marcus threw a networking dinner at their new penthouse. The invitation said black tie, but I quickly realized it wasn't a family gathering, it was a pitch. Guests walked around with expensive glasses of wine, talking about seed rounds, equity swaps, and strategic legacy transitions. The walls were decorated with large canvas prints of Ava and Marcus smiling on yachts, in Tuscany, in high-rise boardrooms, artificial moments posing as memories. When I arrived, Ava looked surprised. Almost nervous. "You made it," she said, air kissing my cheek. "You didn't have to, really." "Of course I did," I said smoothly. "I wouldn't miss a chance to see what you two are building." Marcus joined us seconds later, wine already in hand. "Maureen," he said with that same condescending tilt of his head, "we're so glad you're here. We've been telling everyone how sharp you are, how much you understand value." I raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Oh yes, especially now, with so many asset consolidations happening in older portfolios. Your name carries weight. And Ava, of course, is part of that legacy. You've built something worth protecting. He was laying bait. Carefully, casually. He wanted me to take the first bite. I didn't. Instead, I smiled, looked around the room, and asked, what exactly are you protecting her from? He blinked, thrown just a little off balance. Well, from risk, from uncertainty, from the volatility of single-source inheritances. You mean, from me? He laughed. Too quickly. No, not at all. Just the way wealth is managed these days, it's smarter to spread risk, not rely on a parent's goodwill. There it was, the framing. I turned to Ava. Her posture was tense. Her hand gripped her wineglass too tightly. Do you feel at risk, Ava? I asked. She didn't answer, just gave that thin, polite smile that never reached her eyes. Later that night, I wandered the hallway of their penthouse while they were distracted with guests. I noticed a door slightly ajar in office. Inside, a wall covered in documents, post-its, flowcharts, financial structures mapped out like a battle plan, trust accounts, estate valuations, family trees with figures circled in red ink. At the top of one sheet, projected transfer, $15M over 10 years. Beside it, underlined, key, soften mother's control narrative. Position Ava as primary executor. It was like stepping into a war room where I was the unnamed enemy. They weren't just building a life. They were building a strategy around me, around the assets they assumed I controlled blindly, around a version of Ava I didn't even recognize anymore. I closed the door without a sound and returned to the living room. I stayed for another hour, smiled, nodded, complimented Ava's new art piece, one she'd clearly never seen before. I played the role of the aging matriarch, generous but irrelevant, warm but unaware. And when I finally left, Marcus saw me to the elevator. We really do admire what you've done, he said, stepping inside the lift with me. Ava's lucky to have grown up with that kind of security. I didn't answer. He waited. You know, we're thinking long-term, family planning, legacy structuring. If there's ever a way to involve you more officially in that, well, I'm sure we'd all benefit. The elevator doors closed behind him. I looked at him slowly, meeting his gaze dead on. You assume I want to be involved, I said softly. He blinked. Don't you? No, I smiled. I prefer to be the one watching from above. And then the doors opened. I stepped into the parking garage and knew exactly what I had to do. Because my daughter hadn't just married a man with ambition. She had married a predator with a plan. And now I would make one of my own. The next morning, I sat at the long mahogany dining table Charles had custom-made 30 years ago, a piece built for family and legacy, not spreadsheets and manipulation. I laid out every document from my private files, our trust paperwork, Charles's last will, the multi-jurisdictional accounts, and the timeline of liquidity transfers I had quietly orchestrated the year after his death. No one, not even Ava, knew that the bulk of the $33 million inheritance had already been moved, filtered, safeguarded. Not hidden, but veiled, from opportunists, from charmers, from men who saw my grief as a gateway. Now it was time to secure every exit. I met with my attorney that same afternoon, a man Charles had trusted with his life and whom I trusted with our legacy. I laid everything bare: Marcus's push for influence, Ava's behavioral shift, the financial diagrams on their wall. He didn't even blink. You want to preemptively revise the clause for forced executor claims? Not just revise, I said. I want it locked. We drew up an amendment to the trust, removing Ava as potential co-executor unless she met 3 non-negotiable criteria: complete independence from her spouse's financial activity, verified by a forensic auditor, proof of contribution to the estate's growth, not just proximity, and a mandatory 10-year delay clause from the time of inheritance activation. In plain English, she'd get nothing, not a signature, not a seat at the table, until she proved she wasn't simply an extension of Marcus. The documents were filed that week, and while I waited for the dust to stir, I began watching. I hired a private investigator, a quiet, ex-FBI type with clean shoes and no social media presence. Within a week, I had what I needed. Marcus's past wasn't criminal, but it was crooked. A trail of dissolved LLCs, failed startups with inflated valuations, one former partner who filed a sealed civil suit settled, not dismissed, and an ex-girlfriend who'd spoken to my investigator on the condition of anonymity. He knows how to study women, she'd said. He knows what they want to hear, and he knows how to make them feel like it's all their idea. I didn't show Ava the report. Not yet. Instead, I invited her to lunch. She showed up 20 minutes late, wearing a blazer that cost more than my monthly property taxes and a look in her eyes I didn't recognize, tight, tired, and wary. Marcus had a meeting, she explained, brushing invisible lint from her sleeve. So I thought I'd come alone. I smiled gently. Good. I wanted to see you. We ordered salads and rosé, the way we used to before she met him. But the rhythm was off. She picked at her food, checked her phone, dodged questions. Then I asked, "Are you happy?" She froze. Of course. Why wouldn't I be? That's not what I asked. A long pause. Then she looked down. Marcus is ambitious. It's not always easy. Is it ever gentle? She didn't answer. Instead, she shifted the subject. He's trying to build something that lasts, Mom. He wants to create something bigger than himself. For our future. I leaned back in my chair. Is that future about both of you or just him, wearing you like a name tag? She stood abruptly. I knew this was a mistake, but she didn't leave. She hovered, waiting for me to say something that would let her stay in the illusion. I didn't. Instead, I said, when you married him, you thought you joined the empire. But what you didn't realize is I am the empire, and I'm not handing it over. Her face crumpled, just for a second, then steeled. You don't get to decide what I'm capable of. No, I said softly, but I do get to decide what I protect. She left without paying the bill. The next week, Marcus made his move. He showed up at my house, uninvited, holding a bottle of wine and that same fake charm grin that had probably opened many locked doors before mine. I think we got off on the wrong foot, he said, stepping inside like he belonged. Ava's been really overwhelmed lately. I wanted to smooth things out. He talked in loops about legacy, alignment, transparency. He hinted at a family trust restructuring that could benefit everyone. Mentioned a startup incubator he was working with that needed liquid security. He even dropped the phrase early distribution strategy. I let him finish. I poured the wine, listened, and then I said, Marcus, when you walked through my door just now, did you think I was your mother-in-law or your Mark? He blinked. Excuse me? Because the only thing worse than underestimating me is thinking I don't know the difference. I handed him a sealed envelope. Inside, the amended trust clauses and a personal statement declaring that any attempt to influence, pressure, or extract financial information from me or my estate would result in immediate removal from all familial consideration, including Ava's conditional access. He paled. You can't do this, he said, voice cracking. I already have. He left in silence. And for the first time since Charles's death, I felt it, that familiar cold clarity that comes when you realize the wolves thought you were the forest floor, but you're the one holding the fire. The silence from Ava lasted almost 2 weeks. No texts, no calls, not even a passive-aggressive comment on social media. She vanished from my life like I'd never existed, as if my refusal to hand over control had severed more than financial expectation. It had shattered her illusion of entitlement. But silence doesn't mean peace. It never does. Not in families like ours. It only means the storm is circling for another way in. On the 15th day, I received a registered letter. It was professionally written, but casually cruel. The tone dressed itself in concern, but every line was laced with suggestion. Ava and Marcus were requesting a formal financial clarity review, citing inconsistent communication about legacy planning and expressing interest in mediation to avoid future misunderstandings. It was a threat, veiled as diplomacy. Worse, it was written not in Marcus's voice, but Ava's. She'd signed it herself. No doubt, he drafted every word, but she'd still picked up the pen. And that, more than anything, told me she was no longer slipping. She had chosen a side. Not her father's. Not mine. His. The next day, I received an alert from one of the banks I monitored through a private channel Charles had established years ago. Someone had attempted to access account verification records tied to an old LLC, one of the vehicles used to transfer capital offshore for tax strategy. The request was denied, of course. The access was blocked before it even reached a login screen, but the attempt left a digital footprint. It had come from Marcus's home IP address, and now we were no longer in the realm of manipulation. We were in the realm of espionage. I gathered the evidence, not just the login attempt, but the original letter, the metadata, the private investigator's documentation, and copies of Ava's financial transactions over the last 6 months, some of which, alarmingly, had begun mimicking the same shell transfers Marcus used in his past ventures. She wasn't just being used, she was being trained. By the end of that week, I had prepared 3 dossiers, one for my attorney, one for the Department of Financial Regulation, and one for Ava, not Marcus. Ava, because if there was any part of her still reachable, any shred of the daughter I'd raised, it would respond to facts, not pleas. And if not, well, the truth doesn't need permission to destroy a lie. But before I delivered it, something happened that changed everything. Ava came to my house and announced, alone. She looked thinner, paler. Her eyes, once so alive with certainty, were shadowed. Her makeup had been done hastily. There was a tension in her jaw I recognized instantly, the strain of someone holding back tears long past their due. "I shouldn't be here," she said before I could even speak. I stepped aside, letting her in. She didn't sit, just stood in the middle of the living room, arms wrapped around herself. "I'm pregnant." The words hit like a rock through glass, but not because I was surprised. Marcus had always struck me as the type to accelerate timelines to lock things in. A baby would complicate everything. Emotionally, legally, publicly. "Does he know?" I asked. She nodded. "He's thrilled. Says it's perfect timing." "Of course he does. And you?" She looked at me, hollowed. "I don't know. It's like I can't tell where his plans stop and mine begin anymore. I feel like I'm living inside something he designed." "You are," I said quietly. She sank onto the couch. "He wants me to push harder. He says you're hoarding money. That Dad would have wanted us to expand the family reach. That you're letting your grief make you selfish." I knelt in front of her, held her gaze. "Ava," I said softly, "you know your father. You know me. Do you think I would ever withhold out of spite?" She hesitated. "No, but you're controlling." I smiled gently. "Only when the stakes are this high." She didn't cry, but her eyes gleamed, and she whispered, "I'm scared." "Then listen very carefully," I said. "Because from this point forward, you're either with me or you're in the line of fire." I handed her the sealed envelope, the one with the proof, the one with the login attempt, the one with Marcus's ex-business partner's affidavit, and screenshots of the inheritance map he and his lawyer had tried to draft in my name. She opened it slowly, page by page, her breath caught, her face strained, her hands shook. By the time she reached the final page, she looked 10 years older. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I thought you trusted him." She nodded. "And now," I said, rising to my feet, "you have a choice." She looked up at me, tears finally slipping down her cheeks. "What do I do?" I walked to the window, looked out over the garden Charles had planted for her when she was 6, and said, "You helped me burn it down. Every lie, every plan, every piece of the machine he built. Or you walk back into the penthouse, and you lose me forever." The silence that followed was sharp, heavy, and then she stood, and without a word she nodded. By the time Ava left my house that night, the mask had fully slipped from her face. Not just the one she wore for me, but the one she had worn for herself. I watched from the window as she crossed the dark lawn in silence, arms folded tightly across her chest, her gait slower than usual. Not hesitant, deliberate. She wasn't running from Marcus. Not yet. But something inside her had finally snapped out of its daze and started taking notes. And now that the fantasy had cracked, I knew it was time to dismantle everything. I began with the foundations Marcus had spent years quietly laying. The first target was public credibility. While Marcus had no official criminal record, his professional history was a minefield of strategic collapses, non-disclosures, and overhyped projects built on inflated promises. I called in a favor from a former journalist Charles and I once helped during an industry defamation suit. She now ran an investigative blog with a focus on private sector fraud and emerging tech cons. I handed her a sealed packet, company filings, shell firm registries, partner statements, and financial inconsistencies going back almost a decade. Within a week, her team had pieced together a damning exposé titled "The Prince of Pitch Decks: Inside the Rise and Quiet Collapse of Marcus Farrow." It hit like a bomb across the VC world. Phrases like unverified valuations, investor gaslighting, and potential misrepresentation of fiduciary access sent former clients, partners, and associates scrambling to publicly distance themselves. Marcus's name, once dropped in elite startup circles, now prompted nervous laughter and tight-lipped shrugs. But that was only the beginning. Next came the financial decapitation. I initiated a forensic audit of all transactions Marcus had influenced or initiated using Ava's name, including a string of LLCs she was legally tied to without her knowledge. Once those accounts were frozen under pending investigation, I had my attorney deliver a letter to Ava's bank, revoking all previous permissions and redirecting her remaining liquid assets into a new account under her name alone, safeguarded with conditional legal oversight until a divorce or formal legal separation. The word divorce hadn't yet passed Ava's lips, but the ground beneath her had already shifted. She moved into one of the guest houses on my property a few days later, quietly, without announcement, with only a single suitcase, a few books, and one picture of her and her father at a childhood fair. "I'm not ready to talk about it," she said, setting the photo on her nightstand. "But I can't be there anymore." "You don't have to be ready," I told her. "You just have to stop pretending." That night, I showed her something I hadn't shared with anyone since Charles died, a sealed USB drive kept inside a false bottom drawer in our old safe. It contained what Charles had called the wall, a digital blueprint of every layer of protection he'd installed around the estate. It was part legacy, part firewall, and it was brilliant. The structure ensured that even if anyone ever got close, they'd only find surface-level assets, decoys. The real wealth, the blood of the empire, was locked 5 layers deep, across multiple names, trusts, and geo-financial entities. Ava stared at the map in stunned silence. Marcus thought he was playing chess, I said. But Charles built the labyrinth. She nodded slowly, still absorbing. So the money he's after? He'll never reach it. No, I said. But he doesn't know that yet. And that was our advantage. Because men like Marcus didn't operate on truth. They operated on momentum, on bluff, on the belief that no one would ever outplan them. But now, for the first time in his life, Marcus was standing on a foundation he hadn't built. And it was already cracking beneath him. The final blow began with a legal move Charles had set in motion years ago, one even Ava didn't know about, something called a voluntary disassociation clause. It allowed me, as the surviving trustee and majority stakeholder of the Keene estate, to issue a formal declaration removing any spouse, even an in-law, from proximity-based claims to assets if their relationship to a family member posed a threat to structural security or long-term estate value. Marcus, as Ava's husband, had no idea such a clause even existed, but I activated it quietly and cleanly. The document was filed in 3 jurisdictions. Overnight, Marcus lost the legal grounds to ever claim access to anything tied to my name, Ava's name, or Charles's legacy. He would learn about it the following week, when the eviction notice arrived at his office, followed by the lawsuit, followed by the press. But the best part? He wouldn't know where the punch had come from. Because while he'd spent months playing the long con, I had spent a lifetime building the walls he would crash into head first, never even seeing them coming. And Ava? She was no longer a pawn. She was about to become my sharpest piece. By the time Marcus received the notice of disassociation, the city was already humming with whispers. The exposé on his business dealings had sparked conversations in the right circles. Bankers, investors, compliance officers. People he once called close contacts were now ghosting him in meetings, canceling calls, and reconsidering their alignment. The penthouse he bragged about on podcasts? Under review by his lender. His favorite weekend escape in Napa? Quietly taken off the shared booking calendar by the management company. No one wanted to be next in line when the ship finally sank. He called Ava. She didn't answer. He sent her an email. Whatever you think is happening, you're being manipulated. Come home. We can still fix this. She forwarded it to me. No subject line, no body text, just the forwarded message, like she was handing me the last bit of him she still carried. I read it, then deleted it. Some things don't deserve preservation. Then came the escalation we'd been expecting. His legal counterstrike, a petition filed under the guise of a preemptive protection motion, claiming Ava was being coerced into surrendering her marital financial rights. He argued emotional distress, undue influence from a parental figure, and cited unexplained account shifts as evidence that the family was hiding money from him. He requested a freeze on Ava's assets, a full forensic review of the estate, and temporary spousal access to ensure financial equilibrium. It was absurd, but also strategic. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to delay, to spook, to bait us into errors. He didn't understand he was already 5 moves behind. Ava and I had preemptively filed a formal marital fraud report with supporting documentation, IP traces, shell company patterns, inconsistencies in investment reports, and the affidavit from his ex-business partner. Our legal team attached the article as supporting public evidence of intent and behavior and included a private letter signed by Ava herself. I rescind all consent previously given, implied, or stated to my husband Marcus Farrow regarding access to any trust, account, business, or asset linked to the Keene family estate. I was manipulated, lied to, and financially directed under the guise of partnership. I now see it for what it was: control. That statement was like a guillotine, clean, irrevocable, and final. But we didn't stop there. We filed a protective financial injunction, a move few families ever pursue because it draws blood publicly. It essentially treated Marcus as a threat to the estate, not just the marriage. The consequence? His legal status as Ava's spouse no longer entitled him to any information, involvement, or presence in anything the Keene name touched. That included assets he didn't even know existed. The court hearing was swift. He arrived in his usual suit, but the cockiness had dulled. He looked thinner, harsher, a man no longer basking in the confidence of a good lie, but scrambling to survive its collapse. I sat beside Ava, wearing Charles's lapel pin, a quiet signal that I had brought legacy with me into the courtroom. Marcus tried to charm the judge. He smiled, spoke softly, talked about love, about being blindsided, about not understanding why his wife had changed so suddenly. But then the evidence came, line by line, transfer by transfer, lie by lie. By the end of the hour, even the judge's tone had shifted. She turned to Marcus and said, "You may think the law protects ambition, Mr. Pharaoh, but it does not protect ambition without integrity." Motion denied, all requests thrown out. And the final blow? The court formally acknowledged the voluntary disassociation clause, a rare, pre-established private estate protocol now ratified in court record. It meant Marcus would never, under any circumstance, be able to lay claim to a single cent of the Keene legacy. Not now, not in divorce, not through future children, nothing. He stormed out of the courtroom that day. Ava stayed seated beside me, still, quiet, trembling, not from fear, but from release. For the first time, she looked like the woman she was supposed to be. Not a pawn, not a passenger, a force. We exited together, side by side, and in the lobby, as the press tried to swarm with questions, I turned to her and whispered, "Don't flinch." She didn't. She walked straight through the cameras, head high. And in that moment, I knew Marcus had tried to steal her birthright. But instead, he had forged her rebirth. By the time the courthouse doors closed behind us, Marcus was no longer just a man who'd overplayed his hand. He was a man without a table to play at. He'd been formally cut off, publicly humiliated, and legally dismantled. But for men like him, ruin isn't real until their reputation is in shambles. He still believed he could recover, reinvent, find another investor pool or consulting gig, smooth talk his way back into the fold. He didn't know I had already salted the earth. You see, Charles and I had built more than wealth. We'd built a network discreet, quiet, and loyal. Attorneys, bankers, editors, policy advisors, women and men who didn't make headlines, but who wrote the contracts behind the headlines. And when Marcus began moving against me, I didn't just move to protect myself, I began preparing a final strike that would remove his name from every space that once held potential. I started with the investor blacklist. It wasn't formal, no published list, no flashing warning, just a well-placed conversation with a well-connected fund manager who owed Charles 2 decades worth of favors. The message traveled quickly. Marcus Pharaoh is radioactive. No investments, no meetings, no partnerships. Next came the silent retreat of capital. Marcus had 3 early-stage projects he was trying to pitch, one of them a fintech platform he claimed would revolutionize access to generational wealth. The irony nearly made me laugh. I didn't need to kill the projects. I just had to disrupt the oxygen around them. 3 of the angel investors he had been courting suddenly pulled back with vague apologies, shaky legal optics, reputational risk. Timing isn't ideal. Without even touching a courtroom, I'd severed his wings. But the real revenge came not from what I took, but what I exposed. Because I wasn't the only one Marcus had charmed. There were others. Women, clients, partners. People he had used for stepping stones, silenced with money or shame. And now, they were coming forward. One of them, Elena Caldwell, a former financial advisor, had signed an NDA after a professional fallout with Marcus years ago. When she heard about the court case, she reached out to my team, quietly, anxiously. She had evidence, emails, audio clips, internal docs showing Marcus bragging about leveraging family wealth through marriage. He called it targeted legacy extraction, she told us. Like it was a business strategy. I knew exactly what to do with that. My journalist contact from earlier had been biding her time, waiting for a second wave. We gave her everything Alina shared, and what she published next wasn't just a follow-up, it was a reckoning, marrying into millions. The legacy games of Marcus Pharaoh. The story dropped on a Thursday morning. By noon, it was on every major feed. The headline alone was enough to light a fire, but the content? It was a scalpel. Precise, verified, and forgiving. Direct quotes, charts, a breakdown of how Marcus had historically targeted women with either generational wealth or vulnerable family structures, how he operated as a chameleon, mirroring values, manipulating trust, and proposing financial structures that ultimately rerouted control back to him. Every tactic, every victim, every dollar accounted for. Ava read it in silence. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "He never really loved me, did he?" And I answered with the truth. "No, but that doesn't mean you weren't worthy of it." The fallout was immediate and brutal. Marcus's pending contracts were shredded, speaking engagements canceled, his name pulled from a planned Emerging Visionaries panel before the poster ink had dried. Even the luxury car company that had partnered with one of his companies sent a public notice stating they were reviewing prior affiliations for ethical compliance. And the cherry on top? A civil fraud investigation opened by the state. It wouldn't jail him, but it would bankrupt him trying to fight it. Still, I wasn't done, because Marcus had built his entire identity on the illusion of control, a man who walked into every room with the certainty that he'd already won. I wanted him to feel what it was like when the illusion shattered in his own hands. So I hosted a foundation gala, a celebration in Charles's name, by invitation only. A who's who of finance, philanthropy, and social capital. The guest list included 5 people Marcus had desperately tried to impress. They all came, not because of the wine or the music, but because they knew who wasn't invited. I made a speech near the end. I spoke of legacy, of protection, the fine line between love and leverage. I didn't name Marcus. I didn't have to. Everyone in that room already knew. And when the applause came, I looked out across that sea of powerful, attentive faces and felt something I hadn't known I was waiting for: closure. He had tried to use my daughter to steal my empire, but instead, he gave me the reason to fortify it beyond his reach. Marcus didn't go quietly. Men like him rarely do. After the exposé, after the court rulings, after the financial excommunications, he tried everything to claw back even a sliver of dignity. He spun narratives on private channels, tried to leverage sympathy through mutual acquaintances, floated the tired tale of a bitter mother-in-law poisoned by power. He even leaked a doctored photo of Ava and me from years ago, cropping it to suggest physical aggression laughable to those who knew us, but dangerous to those who didn't. He hired a PR firm, the kind that specializes in reputation recovery. But reputation, like glass, doesn't shatter clean. It splinters, invisibly, deeply, and even the best spin doctor can't polish what's already bleeding. What Marcus hadn't realized, what he was fundamentally unequipped to understand, was that this wasn't just a feud. It was a legacy war, and he'd entered it thinking he could extract value from a family that was built from the roots up to survive siege. He had only seen the surface, the wealth, the elegance, the generational rituals, but he hadn't seen the steel, the strategy, the centuries-old understanding passed from woman to woman that money wasn't power until it was protected. And now, that very protection was suffocating him from every angle. His accounts were frozen or gutted. His name was scraped off partnerships like rust. Prospective collaborators ghosted him. Former allies didn't return his calls. Even his reputation recovery firm dropped him discreetly, citing client conflict of interest. One of his last public appearances, a desperate podcast interview, was taken down within 48 hours after a legal review flagged slander and unverifiable claims. He'd become a non-entity, a whisper of disgrace behind every closed door that mattered. And then, inevitably, he turned back to Ava. Emails, voicemails, handwritten letters left at her gate. All variations of the same toxic symphony. I made a mistake. You misunderstood. We were building something real. I was protecting our future. I can fix this. Ava didn't respond. Not once. But one day she asked me, "Do you think he actually believes any of what he says?" I looked at her, then said the only truth that mattered. "I think he believes the story he needs to believe, because the truth would destroy him." She nodded. "Then I'll let the truth do exactly that." So she wrote her own statement. Not for publication, not for the media, but for every woman Marcus had ever manipulated, deceived, or financially compromised. We sent it privately, through my contacts, through mutual lawyers, through email. Ava told them everything, what he said to her, how he moved money, how he played loyalty like an instrument until it broke. And something extraordinary happened. They answered. One by one, women began sharing their stories. Some were brief. Others sent folders of documentation. Some wanted their identities protected. Others gave us permission to publish their names. By the end of the month, we had a list longer than I expected of women Marcus had tried to reduce into stepping stones. And from that list, we created a legal coalition. Each woman filed a civil suit, not jointly, but in succession, like a slow, precise burn across his remaining defenses. Each suit triggered new subpoenas, new depositions, new financial audits. He couldn't consolidate, couldn't regroup, couldn't breathe. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was reckoning. And then, just when it seemed like he might still try to climb from the wreckage, Ava delivered the final blow, the divorce papers. She didn't send them through a firm. She delivered them herself, in person, in daylight, in public. She walked into the Midtown cafe where he still pretended to work, sat across from him, slid the envelope across the table, said nothing, and stood. But just before she left, she leaned in and whispered, "You married me for power, but all you gave me was a reason to take it back." She walked out into the sun. He never chased her. That night, we opened a bottle of Charles's favorite red and sat on the veranda, not in celebration, But in reflection, the wind was soft, the house quiet, and I looked at my daughter, not the girl she had been, not the wife she had tried to be, but the woman she had become. A woman forged not in fire, but in control, discipline, and a fierce commitment to never let herself be used again. Marcus had lost, but more importantly, we had won. The months that followed were quiet in the most unusual way. Not the silence of uncertainty or fear, but the silence that arrives after a war, heavy, clean, and absolute. The kind of silence where every footstep echoes just a little more clearly. You begin hearing yourself again, and in that you start to recognize who you were all along, before betrayal, before manipulation, before you had to harden yourself just to survive people who swore they loved you. Ava and I spent that first season of peace and recovery. Not just physically, though she needed it, but an identity. She moved permanently into the house Charles had bought for her years ago, long before Marcus. A place he'd kept under my name to avoid any future claims, just in case Ava marries someone who wants access more than love, he'd said. At the time, I thought it was paranoid. Now I knew better. She repainted the rooms herself, tore out the remnants of that curated life she had built around Marcus. Gone were the pretentious modern art pieces, the steel and glass decor meant to impress hedge fund friends. In their place, soft rugs, family photographs, books that didn't just look good on shelves. They were read. Real life seeped back into her world room by room. And then, one morning, she called me over. I arrived to find her in the nursery. The baby hadn't been a secret. She told me early on that she'd decided to keep it. But this was the first time I saw the reality of that choice. Pale green walls, a mobile slowly turning above a white crib, sunlight pouring in through gauzy curtains. Ava stood by the window, cradling her belly, strong and silent. "Do you think he'll try to find us again?" she asked. I didn't have to ask who she meant. "No," I said. "He's not hunting anymore. He's surviving." It's different. We didn't talk about Marcus after that, not because we forgot, but because he no longer mattered. The courts had finalized the divorce. The lawsuits from the other women were underway, each one a slow grind of accountability Marcus couldn't afford to fight. He'd relocated to another city, changed his last name, tried to sell consultations online under a pseudonym. It didn't work. His face was too recognizable now, not from fame, but from infamy. The world had learned who he really was, and no rebranding could hide rot that deep. Meanwhile, my work shifted. With Charles gone and the financial fortress fully intact, I began restructuring the estate, not just to protect assets, but to prepare them for impact. Quiet scholarships, land conservation, women-owned startups. A trust was created specifically for Ava's child, not just to ensure wealth, but to ensure freedom. Freedom from dependency, from exploitation, from needing to impress the wrong people to be deemed worthy of love or safety. But the biggest shift happened inside Ava herself. She started speaking at forums, first small ones, then larger, panels on economic manipulation and domestic partnerships. The way power can wear a tailored suit and smile with practiced sincerity. She wasn't angry when she spoke. She was precise. Focused. She never said Marcus's name. She didn't need to. She had become a mirror for every woman who had looked at their relationship and quietly wondered, is this love or leverage? And people listened, because survivors can't be ignored forever. Eventually we rise, and when we do, we bring mirrors with us. One day, after she spoke at a university panel, she came home and found me in the garden. We sat on the bench Charles had carved, wind in the trees, the scent of lavender rising around us. "Did I ruin my life?" she asked, so softly I almost missed it. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I answered, "No. You reclaimed it." She exhaled like she hadn't breathed in weeks. And for the first time since this all began, I saw peace in her posture. Not relief, not escape. Peace. In the years that followed, the world moved on as it always does, but I watched my daughter rise like a tide that no one saw coming. Ava didn't just heal, she transformed. She built a consulting initiative that helped women exit financial abuse and high net worth relationships. It started as a few quiet referrals from attorneys I introduced her to, then bloomed into an organization with real teeth, real reach. One of the women she helped called her the quiet sword behind velvet gloves. I couldn't have described her better. Meanwhile, I turned inward not in retreat, but in legacy. Charles had always told me, true power doesn't announce itself. It builds, layer by layer, until its presence is undeniable. I had lived in the shadow of that mantra for decades, not realizing until he was gone that I had internalized every ounce of it. The empire he built wasn't cold steel and bottom lines, it was discipline, preparation, and love, weaponized through wisdom. So I made sure our grandchild would inherit more than just money. I set up something that Charles and I had once dreamed of but never had time to complete, a private family trust advisory council. The core idea was simple: teach the next generation not just to hold wealth, wealth, but to understand it, wield it, protect it, and deploy it with purpose. Not for status, not for control, but for resilience, for independence, for the ability to say no without fear of collapse. Ava became the youngest council member, not because she was my daughter, but because she had earned it in ways no business degree could ever replicate. And as for me, I started writing again. Journals, mostly. Sometimes long letters to Charles I never sent. Sometimes lessons I wanted our grandchild to read one day, lessons about love, power, betrayal, and above all, clarity. That's what I had come to value most in life. Not certainty, not ease, but clarity. The kind that doesn't blink when charm walks into a room and tries to rewrite your story. Eventually, Ava gave birth to a daughter. She named her Lillian. When I held her in my arms for the first time, it felt like holding not just new life, but new hope, a living promise that the cycle would be different this time. That this little girl would grow up surrounded not by wolves wearing wool, but by women who had learned, burned, and come out harder, wiser, freer. At the naming ceremony, Ava stood before our closest friends, looked at me, and said something I'll never forget. They say you don't really become your own woman until your mother lets go of your hand. But mine didn't let go. She held on until I was strong enough to hold myself. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Marcus? He was a footnote by then, a cautionary tale among investors and litigators. Rumors floated of him working from a backroom consultancy under a false LLC, but no one took him seriously anymore. His name, once slick and promising, now came with the subtle recoil of a lesson learned too late. He never met his daughter. Ava never offered. He never asked. That was the true and not some grand gesture, not a court order, but irrelevance. He disappeared from our lives not with a bang, but with the cold, quiet finality of a man who once thought he could steal an empire and learned he couldn't even buy back a seat at the table. And me, I tend my garden now, watch the seasons, laugh more, worry less, because the woman I raised is no longer a target. She's a fortress, and the world, it's finally learning what it means to underestimate the wrong family.